let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so this is the course calendar again. We've finished week 7, and we're actually in this week that doesn't really count as a week. This week right here. If you get on Canvas, you'll notice that there is some material there. So you click on it to see what the material is. I'm going to basically talk about the assignment that's going to come in a couple of weeks. Next week, when we come back, there's an exercise involving analog electronic design or digital electronic design. Depends on how you want to interpret it. I don't know that next week's work has any programming per se, so electrical engineering is going to say, yay, no programming. The memos that have been written, A1, B1, A2, next week will be the last memo. But then the week after that, in week 9, there's going to be some more work. But what's due that week is an experimentation report. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about what goes into that written communication and the experimentation report. So kind of giving you a heads up of what is going to be due in 2 weeks from today. All right, so if you go to Canvas and click on this dot right here, there's some files there for you to take a look at. And this is an excerpt out of one of the files, and it's called General Writing Guidelines. Okay, the file's called General Writing Guidelines, and I'm just taking a few of the slides out for this afternoon. Okay, this thing talks about memos, talks about notebooks, talks about the experimentation report, and what I'm showing today is just focusing on the experimentation report. So the assignments that are done this term are the memos, and we're just not completely done with those. Everybody should have written 3 memos, 2 of them graded. And then in 2 weeks, what is due is known as what we're going to call an experiment report. Now in past semesters, we had you write a full design report about something. But this semester, and it's actually starting last spring, we narrowed it down to just writing about an experiment. And the purpose of writing about an experiment, or why do we do an experiment, is just to try to confirm something. And so the evaluation of that report will be based on 2 things. Number 1, can we come up with some sort of experiment to get the data that we need? And then, again, looking at the general quality of the writing. Now, if you look at the assignment, if you go down here and click on this experimentation assignment, it's going to tell you have to write an experimentation report on some experiment in some of the weeks of work that we've done. And what's going to be allowable is for you to write a report about maybe this, the keypad controller. So you could write about an experiment that demonstrates that the keypad controller works. Or the programmable timer works, the stopwatch, they show that it works. Or the pulse width modulation experiment, or next week's work. Next week's work is the motor drive. So you got 4 different choices that you can write about. You and your teammate each need to pick one. They need to be different. Okay, so we don't have 2 people writing about the same thing on that team. So pick one of these 4 topics, and you'll write about an experiment that's used to collect data about this design, this design, this design, or this design. You don't have to write an explanation about how the design works. You don't have to write an explanation about what went into the design. You just got some sort of system here that you're going to do an experiment on to try to understand how it works. Okay, so what we're going to do now is take a look at some of the guidelines for their experiment report. Okay. So you're going to start off, it's going to look just like a memo. More formal reports, you might have a cover page or something like that, but for the purposes of this class, just start off just like it was a memo. Okay? Do the same heading block as you've been doing for the memos. The only difference is since everybody's writing one, you don't need to put your teammate's name. Just put your name on it. And then write a very short abstract saying this report describes experiments that prove the world is flat, or something like that. Okay, very concise description of what is being reported. Should be just a few words. It'd be nice if you have something interesting that you would report that. You can include that in the abstract. You say, okay, this is a report describing experiments showing that the world is flat, and we discovered from our experiments that we were wrong. The world is round. Okay, so you're done with your abstract. Now the body is what I'm going to talk about on the next slides, and then if you have any supporting materials that don't format very nicely, then you can stick them in the appendices. Okay, so let's turn our attention to the body, basically the elements. Okay, and so the elements of the experiment report is, first of all, you need to describe what is the desired data. So maybe, for example, you choose, as an example, let's say we're going to write about the motor drive. It's a type of amplifier. It's supposed to be very efficient. And so efficiency is power out divided by power in. And so maybe you say, my experiment was to measure the efficiency of my amplifier. Well, what might be, if I want to write about efficiency, what data do I need in order to calculate power? So describe the data. It may be voltages and current. Voltages and currents, inputs and output. Okay, from that data, then I can calculate power and can calculate efficiency. The next thing is that should be in the report is how is the data collected? Basically describe the experiments. Tell us what are the instruments that are being used. Tell us what are the procedures. Okay. You may have, for example, you may have a circuit diagram, and you may say, I need to measure the voltage at node A in the diagram, and I need to measure the current in the branch labeled B in the diagram, and just go through the procedure. The main thing is this question: is the experiment reproducible by the reader? Okay. If you just say, well, I used an oscilloscope to measure some voltages, that's kind of vague. It's not sure exactly what you measured, and we want to make sure that the reader, if they chose to do the experiment, would come up with the same data that you did, or somewhat similar. Otherwise, they may be tempted to say, well, I think that's fake news. All right? So the question you should ask yourself as you're writing about procedures and instruments is, am I writing in sufficient detail that the reader can reproduce what I did? Now, in some experiments, you may end up with tons and tons of data. Now you got to think about, how do I present the data? So you need some sort of presentation of data. Some data may be suitably presented in tables. Others might require some graphs. Okay, so you think about how you might present the collected data. And then finally, in the body of the report, you need to draw some conclusions from the data. And this is the thing where students a lot of times will, if there's something they could improve on, it would be drawing conclusions from the data. So let me talk about next a little bit about presentation, presenting the results, experimental results. Think about how you can use graphs, tables, figures to present the data. If you make a figure, be sure to do a label as well as a short descriptive caption. Okay? If you're doing a table or a figure, try to figure out some way that you could put the desired behavior and the actual behavior and present it in such a way that it's easy for the reader to see them both. So like maybe if you're doing a table, you could say, well, here's my desired column of data, and here's my actual. You could do a table like this, and put them down like here, and then you can put maybe a column that says percent difference, and that might be a third one. So if you did a table, it might be something like this. If you did a figure, maybe you say, well, I'll label my axes, this is time, this is, I don't know, frequency, and maybe I desired, you say, this is my desired, label that as desired, and this is my actual. Okay, put them both on the same graph, if it's feasible. That way the reader can see how things went. Okay. After you present the data, we want to draw conclusions from the data, and so here, let me make some remarks about that. Try to draw conclusions from the data that's reproducible. Okay. Okay. Try try to avoid subjective comments like design works great. That's a subjective comment. Because what's great in my eyes may be terrible in your eyes. Okay? But this statement, this is a very concrete statement. It's from the data. Okay? It produces a signal whose amplitude is within 2% of the desired values. Is that great or is that not acceptable? Well, that's for the reader to decide. Maybe the reader just wanted something within 5%, and he would say, that's great. Okay? But if another reader said, I really want it 0.2%, he says, you're way off. Okay? But this is a factual statement. It's not a subjective statement. Now, usually in an experimentation report, there's no need to cite any references. But I'm going to ask that you cite a reference in this report anyway. Okay? Just to see if you can cite things properly. Find something to cite. You could say, okay, this is a report talking about experimentation on a keypad controller. And then you can just cite some reference that you used in the past to get information about a keypad controller. You may use this example shows two different ways to list a bibliography. You can list it by number, or you can list it by name and year. Depending on which way you want to list it, you need to cite it appropriately in your in the body of your report. Okay? So if you cite it in the body of the report and you use this style, where you put a 1 here, then you would say, here's my reference. If you cite it this way, where you put last name and year, this is one way to do it. These are just two standard ways of listing and citing references. There are other standard techniques, but I just want you to go ahead and put in some references. Okay, the report is going to be graded in two areas. Number one is the ability to design and conduct experiments, and secondly, number two, how's the writing. There are two rubrics, basically two grading sheets that are in Canvas. If you go to the calendar right here and click on that opens up another module just like it's done for all the other ones. The rubric is listing, the two rubrics are listed there. So there's a rubric for experiments and there's a rubric for writing. So I suggest you review those as well. So what happens is it's going to be turned in 2 weeks from today, actually on a Friday, so it's a little bit more than 2 weeks. And then I'll grade them, return them back, and then you'll have a little bit more time to improve on that. So the university asks us to give every student an experience of improving on their writing. So we'll have another time when you'll submit a revised report to be re-evaluated. Okay, so that's the experimentation report. We've tried to reduce the burden of the writing a little bit by, instead of having writing a full design report, just focus on the experiment. Okay, any questions? All right, we do not have lab this week. So if you want to twist your TA's arm and get them to come in and to do something, catch up or get ahead, that's entirely up to you. But we don't have any labs Tuesday, Wednesday, and so forth. Okay, if there are no questions, then we're done.